We who are weak and wonderful, wicked, bewildered, wistful, and wild, are saying direct good mornings through the fever. These are the words of Gwendolyn Brooks. She was more than just a writer. She was a mother, a teacher, a literary doctor whose words were a salve to a community in desperate need of true representation. Her 1950 Pulitzer Prize was one of her many awards confirming the importance of Black representation on a national platform. Through the work of Brooks Commissions, we embrace her legacy and the continuation of that much-needed representation. Our broad range of offerings include licensing, The Gwendolyn Connection, the book, Seasons, a Gwendolyn Brooks Experience, Graphic Gwendolyn, our illustrated poetry series, and more exciting projects to come. The words of Gwendolyn Brooks are still amazingly meaningful. Whatever your mood or message, her insights challenge and comfort. From the front yard to the back alleys and beyond, she speaks to us. My poem is life and not finished. It shall never be finished. My poem is life and can grow. We are Brooks Permissions. Join us. To find out more, visit GwendolynBrooks.net.
Welcome to Brooks Permissions, a celebration of the 70th anniversary of the publication of Mars Martha, Gwendolyn Brooks' only novel. This celebration is on Ms. Brooks' 106th birthday. Tonight, Sandra Jackson-Opoku, Sandra Cisneros, and Dr. Joanne Gabbin will explore Mars Martha from three different perspectives. We'll begin the program with Sandra Jackson-Opoku, an author and cultural critic. Sandra?
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm happy to be here at the invitation of Brooks Permissions, joining my esteemed colleagues, Sandra Cisneros and Joanne Gabbin, to help commemorate the 70th anniversary of Brooks's only published work of fiction. I am both honored and humbled to be a part of this event. So Maud Martha is very special to me. It's a work I've read and reread for my own enjoyment, that I've studied as a writer, a poet turned fiction writer. And I'm also taught as a university educator. I see myself in a weird kind of twinship with Brooks's every woman heroine, Maud Martha Brown. We were both born in Chicago, not a month apart. I made my appearance in August 1953, while Maud Martha came along in September of that year. I didn't read the novel, though, until I was in my mid 30s, around the same age Brooks was when it was published. So I've been asked to speak about Maud Martha in the context of the times, an experience that I know well through study, through literary citizenship, and also as a fellow member of this shared community. Though I came of age several decades later, I see Maud Martha as part of my literary DNA. The novella is structured in 37 slim chapters. One might call flash fiction a kind of literary ancestor to another iconic Chicago novel, House on Mango Street, which you'll hear about shortly. It is set almost entirely within all Black enclaves on the South Side. The events bookended by the pre-World War II era, roughly the mid-teens, and World War II of the 1940s. Sometimes this particular era, the interwar period, and the place, Chicago, go unrecognized when we consider major moments in the political and cultural story of Black America. So, at the beginning of this period, Chicago is somewhat overshadowed by the New Negro, aka Harlem Renaissance. At the tail end of it, the civil rights movement, the Black Power and Black arts movements of the 1960s through mid 70s also tend to eclipse the era that preceded it. But Black Chicago of the 1920s through 40s is anything but inconsequential. Henry Louis Gates characterizes this period in literary history as one of realism, naturalism, and modernism for its stark portrayals of the kind of gritty urbanism that is seen in works like Richard Wright's Native Son. Literary critic Lawrence Jackson has also dubbed this period the indignant generation, and we can talk later about what makes this generation indignant. So it's the onset of the Great Migration, where over time, 6 million souls abandon Jim Crow segregation, shrinking opportunities in agricultural work, and violent terrorism. They trade it for what Brooks ironically refers to as down, but always beautiful, south, for the urban north and west, also sometimes wryly referred to as up south. I myself am a second generation migrant. My parents, having come from Mississippi up to Chicago as children in the 1920s and 40s. Slavery hadn't been openly practiced in the former Indian territories like Kansas and Oklahoma, though these places had their own history of anti Black oppression. The burning of Black Wall Street in North Tulsa being a case in point. Just like the Civil War exodusters fled to the Southwest, their children and grandchildren began a new outward migration with people like the Brooks family leaving Topeka, Kansas for Chicago. Around when they arrived, around 50,000 Black Southerners had already made it to Chicago in the pre and post World War One era. So the institutional foundation had already been set up to provide a base for the Black economic and community development that would evolve over the next several decades. There had been a Black community in Chicago before this, of course, a much smaller Black community. After all, Chicago, as a modern city, was founded by a Black man. But these were small communities with their own cultural ethos that would be all but absorbed by the sheer numbers of Southern Blacks who brought with them their blues and jazz, soul food, and forms of religious expressions, so much so that what we now recognize as Black urbanism is largely rooted in the experience of these migrant communities. So this is the time period of Maud Martha, the 1920s through the 40s. It corresponds also with Gwendolyn Brooks' childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. One central element of this work, as I see it, is a sense of deep interiority. The protagonist is the shy, dark skinned daughter of a working class family, much like Brooks herself and me. Maud Martha Brown is thoughtful, intelligent, introspective, and sometimes insecure. She's a girl who wants to donate the world a good Maud Martha. She who delights in stories of escaped gorillas and the ordinary beauty of dandelions, the commonest flower, becomes a woman who goes on to spare the life of a mouse, one of the lowliest creatures. Hers is the life of the mind, a richness of imagination and internal self scrutiny. I think only a poet could have penned such a novel with its careful crafted language, the brevity of that life distilled that Gwendolyn Brooks always spoke of, into what are almost snapshots in a photo album of the American Family Brown, which is the original title of Maud Martha. But Maud Martha, don't get it twisted. She doesn't just live in her head. cloistered in her room like some kind of a Black Emily Dickinson. She lives out in the world too. After all, she's a Black girl and she's born in the early 20th century. Things are happening, they're going on. And the uncertainty of the Great Depression, her family almost lose their home. Later on in her early married life, Maud Martha experiences even deeper economic or a sense of economic deprivation. She's in a kitchenette apartment with her husband, barely warmed by these stingy space heaters rather than the steam heat she's grown up with. There's the wider Black culture she participates in music, food, family, and social relationships. There's a war going on far away from home, but it has destabilized home and taken her brother Raymond into its clutches. And of course, the racial issues, because of course, this is an inescapable part of American life then as now. For example, the pleasure of a simple movie date is marred when Martha and her husband realize we're the only colored people here. And then the macro and microaggressions that might ensue from this. She also contends with her own brand of denial when a white woman utters the dreaded N word in her presence. She internalizes her daughter's pain later on when the child is slighted by a white department store Santa Claus. And she even confronts issues of internal racism within her own family and her community. Her childhood crush dismisses her as old Black gal. She worries that a visiting white classmate might think that Negro houses have a certain unpleasant smell. And her husband may, just may, prefer the charms of a dance partner who is whiter than a white, unquote. So this is the Chicago of St. Clair Drake's Black metropolis with the large middle class and deep reservoir of Black wealth, thriving churches, and the iconic Chicago Defender newspaper. This is the flowering period of jazz and blues, visual arts, writers like Richard Wright and Frank London Brown and Margaret Walker. Yet, by contrast, Chicago is also the most segregated large American city. Some areas fairly teeming with poverty and squalor, substandard housing and schools. This is the urban North, not the Jim Crow South, but there are still businesses that won't serve or hire Blacks. Residential and educational segregation persists with no regard to wealth or status. For example, when a wealthy real estate developer, Carl Hansberry, he's the father of playwright Lorraine Hansberry, moves his family into an all-white neighborhood, his home is attacked by white vigilantes, and the neighborhood association sues to kick him out. Carl Hansberry goes all the way to the Supreme Court in a case that would lead to the dismantling of restrictive covenants in real estate. But this gives way to residential blockbusting, redlining, white flight, and rapid resegregation, some of which we are still seeing today. So it is within this universe, in this context, with all of its triumphs and its complexities, where we meet not only Maud Martha Brown, but Annie Allen and Sedleg Smith, DeWitt Williams, Nothing But a Plain Black Boy, Lincoln West, the Kitchenette Folk, and other characters in Gwendolyn Brooks' vast body of work. Maud Martha doesn't just chronicle the coming of age of a woman, after all, but also of a community, a city, and by extension, the greater Black experience. Thank you.
So that was that was wonderful. Um, yeah. That was wonderful. And I'm sorry you all can't see the glow on my face as I'm enjoying this, but I'm having apparently face difficulties. So that's a perfect segue, Sandra J, leading, because you shared so much of Maud Martha's childhood. And that leads us directly into Sandra C. and her sharing of Esperanza's childhood. And so welcome, Sandra Cisneros, and please share your wisdom.
Hi, I am not a critic, so I wrote a personal essay, and there'll be a longer version of this when I publish it, but I wanted to stay within the time constraints. So my essay is Mighty Maud Martha. My treasured copy of Maud Martha is a compact hardcover dressed devoutly as a nun, demure as a prayer book, as unassuming as the author herself. To make it even more sacred, it is dedicated to me and dated April 8th, 1986. I keep it in my bedroom library on a special shelf, for it is valuable and dear, cherished the way Maud Martha longed to be cherished. I first met this book in Sarajevo, in what was then Yugoslavia, under a cherry tree the summer of 1983. My own book, The House on Mango Street, had been finished November 30th, 1982 in Greece. And that cherry that fell from the tree while I was reading it was a premonition for the blood that would fall a decade later. In hindsight, I wish I had stolen the book from the American Library where I had borrowed it. I had wanted to, but who knew a bomb would fall and burn the library and all its contents in the Bosnian War? But before 1983, I want to mention that I was born the year after Maud Martha was published, 1954. But I wouldn't discover poetry till middle school, and even then, not any poetry worth remembering. What I was introduced to in my class book, my textbook, was not Gwendolyn Brooks. I met Gwendolyn Brooks through poetry from paperback editions, little and cheap anthologies that were printed in affordable editions for schools, for students like me. And I would buy the books myself. And this is where I first met Gwendolyn Brooks on paper. And I have to disclose, in 1978, when I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa, I'm a little ashamed about this, but I need to admit it here for the record. I had to submit a poetry manuscript for my thesis, but they also made us jump through another hoop, and that is we had to write a analytical paper. I was terrified. I cannot write an analytical paper to save my life. So I made up something, a comparative paper, lauding Gwendolyn Brooks and trashing Gary Soto, two writers that I admire very much. And I didn't believe a word of the trashing. I'm putting that out there for the record because somebody will look it up at the University of Iowa. And I loved Gary Soto's work as much as I loved Miss Brooks. I was obliged to make up something, and make up I did. The assignment terrified me back when I had no voice and worse, no faith in myself. So sorry, Gary. All right. After I left Iowa, I met Gwendolyn Brooks in person at her annual awards luncheon for the citywide poetry prize she sponsored for elementary and high school students. Fortunately, my students who were high school dropouts returning to finish their high school education at an alternative program were eligible, even though we were a small school of only 50 students in a forgotten, forlorn building in Pilsen that sat so close to the L train we could have leapt from a window and hitched a ride. Every time a train passed, we had to stop our lecture short till the rumble died away. We got used to it. Here, I would collect the stories that would eventually make their way to the autobiographical neighborhood of Humboldt Park, but the students in Pilsen would be woven into the tale, as would my Bucktown neighborhood where I rented an apartment. 5 of my Latino youth students won Gwendolyn Brooks prizes over the 3 years I taught. To this day, I'm still proud of this accomplishment. But that's how Gwendolyn Brooks knew me, as the teacher of award winning writers, not an award winning writer myself. I realized I needed to quit teaching and win my own writing awards. And I did just that in 1982, thanks to a National Endowment for the Arts grant. That's how I wound up finishing my book in Greece, meandering across Europe, and reading Maud Martha in Sarajevo under a cherry tree. As a poet, I related to Maud Martha, which was constructed, according to what I've read, as a series of failed poems. I called my own house on Mango Street vignettes lazy poems when I was writing them, because I knew they weren't poems or prose, but something in between that I was exploring. Stories you could read individually at random or from the left to right, from beginning to end as a series. I wanted the stories to be independent and interdependent. I had never seen story cycles before. I've always been interested in border crossings of genres, and I was very attracted to the boom of Latin America, writers coming from the boom, especially Jorge Luis Borges, who was the initial impulse for writing these little vignettes. And later, after I finished House on Mango Street, I would meet Elena Poniatowska's Lilos Picos, Hermelo Abreu Gomez's Canek, Nelly Campobello's Cartucho on My Mother's Hands, and of course, Maud Martha. Now, Gwendolyn Brooks was the second poet I ever met in my life. The first one was Paul Hoover, that came to my high school. But Gwendolyn Brooks became my mentor without her knowing it. As a public person, she influenced me by the way she treated her fans. And this is something that I will never forget. It was so exceptional about her. She didn't just sign like some authors and just kind of go, She talked to every single one of the fans, and she acted as if we were the famous writers and she was our fan. She taught me how to treat my audiences, how to make small talk, how to look up, to engage them, and to make them feel very special. And to me, this is why Gwendolyn Brooks was such an extraordinary writer, because she was an extraordinary and generous human being. I also met her as a woman one day when I was working at the People's Gas on Michigan Avenue. I stopped at the Stop and Shop, which, if you remember back then, was underground and connected to the subway. And I walked past the bakery counter, and there was Gwendolyn Brooks. I was so astonished. I said, "Miss Brooks, what are you doing here?" And she said, "I'm buying a cake." It knocked me over. I didn't know poets bought cakes. Not someone so famous like Gwendolyn Brooks. She should have been walking on cakes. People should have been delivering cakes to her. I just couldn't believe it. It was just like, to me, that was just like the most astonishing and silly thing, that she had to wait in line. Didn't they know who she was? Well, I knew who she was, and I was impressed that she didn't cut in the line and she waited her turn. Something that most people don't know about Miss Brooks is that she was very generous. She was a philanthropist. I remember once being on stage with her at the University of Houston, and I was over eavesdropping a bit at what she was saying to an English teacher who was lamenting that they didn't have enough money for their literary magazine. And Miss Brooks took out her wallet and pulled out her checkbook and wrote a check for $100. This is back in '86. $100 was like $1,000 now. She wrote it out, and that teacher was just totally just silent and grateful. And I was astonished. And this was something she just did quietly, gave her the check. "This is for your literary magazine." I never forgot that. And something else happened on that trip to Houston that not a lot of people know. She was capable of being a human being a vulnerable human being, because I remember this was the summertime in Texas. And if you have lived in Texas, as I have, everything's bigger in Texas, including the bugs. And she was at a hotel that had a giant cockroach came up, and she was so frightened that she asked to be changed to another hotel, even if she had to pay for it herself. Now, I am very frightened of mice, squirrels, rats, even bunnies. So I get it completely and I identify. And I just felt that was a very human aspect and something I loved about her. My copy of Maud Martha is signed, as I said, April 8th, 1986 in DC. And I said, where was I that got signed? Let me do some research. And I found out that on that day, Gwendolyn Brooks was serving as the consultant at the Library of Congress. This was before we had poet laureates, well, a decade before Rita Dove was poet laureate. She served as consultant, and she was very political and visionary. And she organized an event called An Evening of Chicano Poetry featuring Lorna D. Cervantes, Alberto Rios, Luis Omar Salinas, and me. And it's described as 4 American poets of Mexican descent read from their works. And it's on an archive of recorded poetry and literature in the Library of Congress. You can look it up. I have no memory of what I read, I have to say, but you can, maybe I'll look it up too. And it was recorded, as I said, April 8th, 1986, and we performed in the Coolidge Auditorium at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And I have to note here, this was before my book of poetry was published. So she invited me before I even had, all I had was a chapbook, a little chapbook with 7 poems called Bad Boys. Not a lot of people looked at that as a legitimate book. We were still, maybe we still are as Chicano writers, like the illegal aliens of American letters, but Gwendolyn Brooks recognized who we were, and she put us on that stage before maybe anybody in Washington, D.C. knew who we were. So I want to give my gratitude to her now, today. Now, researching for today's presentation, I learned Maud Martha was not given a warm welcome at its birth, just as my house on Mongo Street was not given a warm welcome at its birth either. I remember that it appeared in January of '84, and it was disparaged by my Chicano male colleagues, because that was the same month that I moved to Texas when it was first published, and it was critiqued as not being a political book by my revolutionary brothers. So I'm anxious to hear today how Maud Martha was received by her community and her male colleagues in 1953. Maud Martha disappeared from print for a while during its lifetime, and this doesn't surprise me. It was ahead of its time in 1953, and it's ahead of its time now. It speaks with humility and grace of fire still raging today. But when I read it in 1983, I didn't have words for the concept Miss Brooks was pioneering. That it is gaining in strength and popularity does not surprise me either. It deserves to be celebrated and cherished. Nevertheless, it makes the top 10 list of writers, from writers I know. When we pick among ourselves our favorite books, it's on there. For Maud Martha is above all a book writers admire, especially writers who grew up in neighborhoods like Maud Martha's. What I love about this book, what I've always loved from the first time I opened it till now, it's a woman-centered book set in a neighborhood of color. Definitely centered in Chicago, because she names the streets, the shops, Marshall Fields. This is Chicago, unlike my book, where I tread carefully and made it a point not to mention any streets, because I wanted my story, naively, to be every man's city. I was so young. I thought, if I don't mention the neighborhood and the names, it can be everybody. That's how young I am. My good lucky, I shared a poetry stage with Miss Brooks at the University of Houston downtown campus, April 14th, 1984, and at Loyola University, my alma mater, sometime before I left Chicago in '82. By then, I was happy to tell Miss Brooks in person how I had met her book, Maud Martha in Sarajevo. I had written her a letter. I wish I had a copy of that letter because writing to Miss Brooks was a labor of love, a letter better than a letter because I polished my words as lovingly as she did. What I said, if I recall correctly, well, I can't recall, so I will rewrite it as if I can. Dear Miss Brooks, I am in Sarajevo of all places. How I got here and why would take too long to explain, but a detour called my destino led me here. And wouldn't you know it, there's an American library called the American Library on the street facing the Miljaka River. And in this library, I found your wonderful Maud Martha, which I'm ashamed to say I hadn't read till now. Maybe I had to come all the way to Sarajevo to meet your book. That is certainly part of my destino, too. I was able to borrow your novel along with a copy of T.S. Eliot's book of practical cats. Why this pairing? Surely because they were both poetry. I read your Maud Martha under my friend Anna's cherry trees on the opposite side of the river from the library. It was the season of the cherry trees bearing their fruit. This will forever be engraved in my mind because as I was reading the Eliot book, a cherry dropped from the sky and left a permanent magenta stain on the creamy page, and the book wasn't mine. I've always been especially nervous of mistreating books taken out of libraries precisely because they are borrowed. If you travel to Sarajevo, go to the American Library and look up Eliot's book. You have only to thumb through its pages to discover my story is true. But thankfully, no cherries dropped from the sky when I read your beautiful book, which is so much like the book I just finished writing. I am certain future readers will think they are related. I do think writers and books are related, don't you? When we recognize ourselves in the pages of others, we are kin. If this is so, I trace my literary genealogy to my Midwest roots, to reading your poetry during my high school years. Miss Brooks, do I have your permission to claim you as my literary madrina, my literary godmother? It will be an honor, if I may. Sincerely, your ahijada, Sandra. Thank you so much for allowing me to celebrate Miss Brooks. And felicidades to you, Miss Brooks. I know you are here listening.
Sandra Jackson-Opoku shared so much of the time of period of Maud Martha. And Sandra Cisneros told how the structure of Maud Martha helped to shape her wonderful lazy poems in Mango Street. Thank you. And now we stand by for Dr. Joanne Gabbin. Now it's time for you to enlighten us with the up and up, the now and now.
I am so happy to be here to talk about the reception and continued relevance of Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha. It has been a pleasure to listen to Sandra Cisneros talk about the context in which Maud Martha was written, and Chicago at the time that she was imagined, and to also listen to Sandra Cisneros and hear her talk about the generosity of Gwendolyn Brooks. I knew that generosity so well. It's an honor to be here and to talk about her distinguished and iconic career. Brooks set all kinds of records as a poet, educator, activist, and novelist. Her winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1950 for Annie Allen, opened the gates for American writers of African descent to win other major literary awards. In 1968, when the Black Arts movement was gaining strength and followers, Brooks succeeded Carl Sandburg as Poet Laureate of Illinois. From this position, she conducted writers' workshops for the Black Stone Rangers, inspired the activists and writers of the Organization of Black American Culture, better known as OBASI, and became a major proponent of Black publishers, namely Broadside Press under the directorship of Dudley Randall and Haki Madabuti's Third World Press. In 1970s, when those in the feminist womanist movement, such as Barbara Christian and Mary Helen Washington, were looking for models, Brooks had a gallery of portraits of women who defied the stereotypes that had come to represent Black women in American literature. We need only remember the Ballad of Pearl Bay Lee, or Jessie Mitchell's mom, or Cousin Vitt, to realize the brilliance of her portraits. In the 1980s, critics like my mentor, George Kent, D.H. Mellom, Claudia Tate, and Mari Evans began to give Brooks's work, including Maud Martha, a sustained and insightful critical assessment. The final decade of her life, she garnered more literary prizes, awards, and honorary degrees. I am personally delighted that I was able to launch the Furious Flower Poetry Conference at James Madison University in 1994 with her blessing. And now on that campus stands the Furious Flower Poetry Center, which is dedicated to her. And in 3 years, in the newly renovated library, there will be a reading room that's called the Gwendolyn Brooks Reading Room. So needless to say, when Nora called on me to talk about Maud Martha, I could only say yes. In Brooks's only novel, Maud Martha, published in 1953, she gives us a fully imagined Black woman who, as the frontispiece announces, was born in 1917 and is still alive. We meet this woman who likes the ordinary dandelion, as you heard, wants to be cherished for her kindness and her mind, ruminates on death and dying, dreams of romance and a suitable beau, experiences the joys and the pains of motherhood, and ends up in a gray and graying kitchenette. Of course, there's much more to the life of Maud Martha, and Brooks creates poetic vignettes to introduce us to this singular character who has never been seen before and certainly was not expected. Gertrude B. Rivers, in one of the earliest reviews of the novel, writes that Maud Martha addresses the concerns of the average woman in her struggle for spiritual satisfaction as daughter, wife, and mother. Rivers unfortunately dispenses with the complicating factors of class, race, and gender by only mentioning the compromising, quote, mandates of poverty and the color of her skin. Like Ann Petrie in her debut novel, The Street, Brooks creates a character that comments on the racialized spaces that Black people must contend with. Ann Petrie's Ludi Johnson in Harlem in the 1930s. And of course, Maud Martha in Bronzeville at about the same time. The injustices and equities of the social and economic systems and the hierarchies in class that separate the haves and the have-nots. When Petrie published The Street in 1946, Richard Wright had already set the publishing world ablaze 6 years earlier with Native Son. When Brooks published Maud Martha in 1953, Ralph Ellison had introduced the world to the unnamed character in Invisible Man. Mary Helen Washington argues that Invisible Man overshadowed Maud Martha, effectively making Brooks's character the invisible woman to the American audience and limiting the exposure of the novel in terms of marketing and recognition for national prizes. While Ellison's novel was embraced by the traditional canon and compared with male novelists like Richard Wright and William Faulkner, Maud Martha, a complex and powerful urban novel, was relegated to the status of, if you will, charming and delightful reading. However, Barbara Christian, in her essay, Nuance and the Novella, a study of Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha, identifies the uniqueness of Maud, who creates her own world by transforming externals through her thoughts and imaginings. Brooks encourages us to see Maud's stunted expectations in the chapter Everybody Will Be Surprised, as she understands the reality that she cannot afford a anything more than a stove-heated kitchenette flat. Maud says, "Oh, I wouldn't like that. I've always lived in steam." And Paul retorts, "I've always lived in stove till a year ago. It's just as warm and about $50 cheaper." Brooks also introduces us to Maud's quiet yet necessary rage in the chapter called The Self-Solace, in which she witnesses a Black hair salon owner make light of a racial slur, casually hurled by a white saleswoman. Christian writes that Brooks paints a portrait of a woman who is constantly made aware of her lack of status as a woman, a Black person, a dark-skinned woman, a member of a despised class. Yet, she is always aware of her self-worth. She never loses sight of that. Though her editors at Harper's, from the very early drafts of the novel, which, as you heard earlier, was called American Family Brown, cautioned her against over stereotyping of whites and caustic racial comments. Brooks achieves a realistic view of race relations with her brilliant use of irony, humor, and understatement. D.H. Mellon writes, "The poet's own life-nourishing qualities define her heroine. Anger recedes, rage glimmers and gleams, but sanity lights the path. This is not yet the essential sanity, Black and electric, called for in the Mecca. Black certainly, but the current is of low voltage here," the end of Mellon's quote. However, it is clear to me that Maud's rage is simmering. Take, for instance, the chapter I talked about just a moment ago, in which the white saleswoman closes a deal with Sonia Johnson, the salon owner, for 10 Black Beauty lipsticks. "People," confided Miss Ingram, "think this is a snap job. It ain't. I work like a nigger to make a few pennies, a few lousy pennies." Maud Martha's head shot up. She did not look at Miss Ingram. She stared intently at Sonia Johnson. Sonia Johnson's sympathetic smile remained. We again see in the chapter at the Burns Coopers, Maud's checked anger, as Mary Helen Washington calls it, when she refuses to endure the disdain of this privileged woman who cannot conceive that Maud's life in any way compares with hers. And you hear Maud saying, "I'll never come back," Maud assures herself when she hung up her apron at 8 in the evening. She knew Mrs. Burns Cooper would be puzzled. And she goes on later to say, why? One was a human being. One wore clean nightgowns. One loved one's baby. One drank cocoa by the fire or the gas range come the evening in the wintertime. The novel's relevance today is without question. The segregated society of Maud Martha is not unfamiliar to us. With the brazen attempts by the conservative right to reverse civil rights gains of the 1950s and the 1960s in tampering with voting rights, the banning of Black books, a travesty, and Black curriculum, using absurd and hypocritical attacks on critical race theory. The planned, if you will, and orchestrated mass incarceration of Black and brown bodies, the suppression of women's rights to their bodies, and poverty as a continuing consequence of an American caste system. The environment painted in Maud Martha, now 70 years old, is an impressionistic image of the ills and dangers we face today. The world that Brooks imagines Maud dreaming about is receding as a possibility for increasing numbers of Black and poor people. Privilege and wealth are reserved for fewer and fewer people as nations become economic tools for billionaires. The novel also speaks to the continued obsession with the standards of beauty that are in contradiction with Blackness. We hear Maud say, "I am not a pretty woman. If you marry a pretty woman," she says to Paul, "you could be the father of pretty children, envied by people, the father of beautiful children." The persistence of these notions about colorism and the universal acceptance of Caucasian features as beautiful is as dismaying now as it was then. I have read Maud Martha at least 7 times over the last 3 decades. And each time I read it, I come away with the conviction that Brooks wants us to see the essence of life, live fully with the joys and challenges that life's vicissitudes demand. Whether showing Maud's teenage insecurities, her dreams of marriage and motherhood, the relationships with her family, and the dynamics of dependence and freedom, Brooks brings us a whole character. D.H. Mellon credits Maud's enduring relevance to its themes of Black and tan, Black and white, economic hardship, female dependence, and muted and outright defiance. Maud Martha shows us a voice that is calibrating the sounds of independence, self-reliance, and identity. Through the character's heroism, we hear the beginnings of the questioning that led to a radical reassessment of our power as Black people and women's liberation. Brooks, in the autobiography report from part 2, says that her novel was beautifully received. You know, she would say that. Though her editor did not expect that it would be appreciated in broad literary circles. Mellum reports that the reviews, especially in Chicago papers, the New York Times, and papers in California, was overwhelmingly good. This novel continues to capture our interest and our praise because Brooks widely uh, consulted her own life in creating Maud. Her deep and abiding respect for the people of Bronzeville illuminated every vignette. And the place where she lived her entire life is alive with the excitement, cultural richness, and hope. Thus, Brooks concludes this novel with these words. And in the meantime, while people did live, they would be grand, would be glorious, and brave, would have nimble hearts that would beat and beat. They would even get up nonsense through wars, through divorce, through evictions and jiltings and taxes. And in the meantime, she was going to have another baby. The weather was bidding her bon voyage. Thus ends Maud Martha, a beautiful, beautiful read. And I, of course, will read it again. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanne. That was just absolutely wonderful. And I think, okay, first of all, truth in advertising. We're going to go over a little bit. I try not to do that. We always try to stay on time, but we cannot let these women go without them having a chance to talk to each other. And so just before that, based on something that the Joanna just mentioned about the self-worth that was evident, but also the self-solace and how she dealt with the rage with humor and irony in certain places. I think it's important to share a story not from Maud Martha, but from the real life of Gwendolyn Brooks. And that is when I was about 8 or 9 or 10, you'll be able to do the math. We went to Marshall Fields to get a new mattress, which was very exciting. And we were there, and the salesman, white, middle-ish aged, came up to us, and he kept referring to us as, hey girls, and everything. And so he worked girl in there in the conversation multiple times. So what can I do for you girls? And Mama responded, well, boy, I'll tell you. Now, bear in mind that if I was between 8 and 10, then this had to be sometime between 59 and 61. So I was older before I realized just how unexpected and how courageous that was. Because that was just something a lot of people just would never have thought of saying to a white man in a store or anywhere else. And so, but that is who Gwendolyn Brooks was, and continued to be. So, I'm going to let people, if they want to work shameless plugs in, they can work their shameless plug in someplace. But I want to go to the general conversation, and you all can talk amongst yourselves. But I want to lead off with one question, and then you all can go anywhere you want to go from there. But then in House on Mango Street, there's a passage where Sandra says, well, Esperanza says, all brown all around, we are safe. But watch us drive into a neighborhood of another color, and our knees go shakety shake, and our car windows get rolled up tight, and our eyes look straight. Yeah, That is how it goes and goes. And in Maud Martha, in the We're the Only Colored People Here chapter, the end of it says, when the picture was over and the lights revealed them for what they were, the Negroes stood up among the furs and good cloth and faint perfume, looked about them eagerly. They hoped they would meet no cruel eyes. They hoped no one would look intruded upon. They had enjoyed the picture so they were so happy. They wanted to laugh, to say warmly to the other outgoers, "Good, huh? Wasn't it swell?" This, of course, they could not do, but only if no one would look intruded upon. So the question that I wanted to ask is, looking at these two examples, and also those of you who are familiar with Mama's poem, Beverly Hills, Chicago, to ask you to speak a little bit on that, about these two books, and also where you think we are now with that kind of feeling or not having that kind of feeling. So just jump in here anywhere.
Yeah, when I spoke about Maud Martha in context, I talked about the kind of racist, both microaggressions and macroaggressions that Maud Martha experienced. And that a particular chapter, We're the Only Colored People Here, was one. It had even more of an impact on me than some of the more overt um, instances of, outright and aggressive racism, like the self solace, because it kind of showed how racial bias and the expectation of it kind of gets into your head, and it kind of, makes you almost anticipate um, what might or might not happen if you are, seen as being somewhere you shouldn't. If you are, and we see today, um, the horrible things that happen to people of color and sometimes white people when they are perceived to be in a public space where they shouldn't be. So yeah, I think, and also that chapter from A House on Mango Street kind of speaks to that insidious uh, uh, microaggressive nature of racism, so that it makes itself appear, even, it kind of travels on even when the people who perpetrate it are not there. You anticipate it, and I think that kind of leads to the post-traumatic stress syndrome that so many people of color experience.
Mhm. Well, if I can chime in, I wrote that book after, collecting the stories from 1980, no, 1970s, 1976 to 7 to 82. And unfortunately, my book is still relevant because the problems are still there. You would think, oh, well, things are going to get better. We were always hopeful that every year was going to get better when I was growing up. If we voted correctly and if we organized, things would get better. They're getting worse. So when I do speak with audiences in Chicago, especially, it's sad that the book is going to be 40 years next year and Maud Martha's 70 years. And these issues are still relevant for our times, even more so now than they were when our books were published. And that's wonderful that the books are relevant, but it's sad that the issues are still there.
I agree. When I was talking about then and now, these issues are here. The dangers, the ills are here. However, there's just one difference. And the difference is that we were fortunate enough to have books like Maud Martha books like Toni Morrison's novels, books like Richard Wright, books like Invisible Man and James Baldwin's essays. And those books have prepared us to respond to this idiotic racism in a different way. So I think as Maud Martha grew in her radicalism, and as Gwendolyn Brooks herself, as a contemporary of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, grew in her radicalism, we are not going to respond in the same way as we did in the 1950s. That is the only hopeful thing I see, that we are not going to take it.
Okay. Thank you for that quote from Network. Are there any other things that you may have heard from each other that you said, oh, I would really like to respond to that, or gee, I never thought of that way, or wait, let me put a note down for that. Any other things that you would like to raise or say to each other?
I want to know why this book has not been selected for a One City, One Read in Chicago. And
Good
why
question.
doesn't Oprah, somebody nudge Oprah who knows her, why hasn't she blessed this book with her attention to bring it the attention? Because I know that writers love this book, but the general Chicagoan population, U.S. population, this is a timely book, especially now. I'm going to keep talking about it everywhere I go because it's one of my top 5.
If you could see me, you see I had raised my fist for say yes.
I agree, Sandra. It would be a wonderful, one book, one Chicago.
Yes.
And the young people need to read this book. And so it would apply to all age groups from middle school on through to college. It is a very necessary book.
The good news is that this year the Chicago Public Library won its a new program, One Poem, One Chicago. Gwendolyn Brooks's collection, Black, has been chosen as the selected work, which includes a kind of comprehensive collection of her poetry, including the full novella, Maud Martha, and the memoirs report from part 1 and part 2. So I predict that Maud Martha will have a whole new audience of readers, at least here in Chicago. And I've always thought, and I'm just going to drop this bug in Nora Brooks Blakely's ear, in case I haven't already, that Maud Martha would make an awesome play or a television series or a screenplay. So, just saying. I had a question for Sandra Cisneros, and that is, I've always wondered, there are so many similarities and parallels and echoes between Maud Martha and House on Mango Street. And I just wonder if there was ever any, I call Maud Martha a kind of literary ancestor to a House on Mango Street. And I always wondered if there's any kind of connection or influence.
As I said, obviously the poetry was in my mind, but I wasn't aware of her story cycle until after I picked up my pen, because I finished House in November 30th, 1982, and I met Maud Martha the following year in the summer, and I was really startled by parallels. I said, I thought I knew Miss Brooks, but I obviously hadn't read this book. And why didn't I read it? I found it in Bosnia, what is present-day Bosnia, former Yugoslavia before the war. I had no idea. But then, a lot of my education, came to me after I left graduate school. a lot of the books that matter to me, the books by women, the books by women of color, the boom writers that influenced me were male writers. I had to dig in the rubble to find the women writers. So the fact that I didn't find Maud Martha till later, in a way, doesn't surprise me, because I've had to dig around and find the books that are meaningful for me as a woman, as a Chicagoan, as a person with working class roots, after I left my education.
I should say that yes, Sandra J, that we were in talks at one point with a film company about the possibility of doing Maud Martha as a film, and so I think it's time for us to work on that again. So there's definitely that. I'd like to give you all each an opportunity to do a quick 30-second plug if you have something. I am a deep supporter of shameless plugs, and I'd like to give you each a chance. If there's something that you'd like to promote or brag on or anything, please take your 30 seconds and go.
Well, I certainly want to say that, first of all, Nora, thank you so much for this. It is wonderful to be here, but I also want to say that the Furious Flower Poetry Conference that Gwendolyn Brooks inspired, that will forever carry her name, will happen again in 2024, September. And we are excited that it's going to happen, the fourth one at James Madison University. And at that particular time, we will, of course, raise the name of Gwendolyn Brooks, as we always do, as the founding dedication for this particular conference, for the center. And as I said earlier, there will also be a section in the library named in her honor. So we are at least one of the important sites for remembering the great contribution of Gwendolyn Brooks. So be there, September the 18th, 2024.
Okay. All right. One down.
I don't know if the audience members can see the chat, but I guess the main thing that I have to share is that a short story of mine won second place in an international competition in the Plentitudes Journal, theplentitudes.com, and you can see that the story is called Geomedia, and it's available free on the Plentitudes.com website. And then I also want to, say that my work with the Gwendolyn Brooks Center for Black Literature and Creative Writing is ongoing. I, along with Nora Brooks Blakely, am a member of the advisory board, and we have some exciting programming coming up around Maud Martha, around the what is now the biannual or biennial, I can't remember which one refers to every other year, Black Writers Conference. So stay tuned for news on that.
2 down, 1 to go.
Thank you, Nora, for bringing us together. This is lovely. I am working on The House on Mongo Street, the opera, with Sir Derek Bermel, and we hope next year to bring a slice of Mongo to, I hope, to my hometown, Chicago, because there's a couple of cities where we'll be previewing it, because it's still in workshop stage. It's not done, but we've been workshopping it for quite some time, and that's, even though House on Mongo Street is going to be 40 next year, I'm still rediscovering it, going very profoundly into the characters and working with Derek Bermel. As I said, you can go online and look up Derek Bermel, Bermel, and listen to one of the arias that he created from the text. So I'm the librettist, which is nothing more than a poet whose words are borrowed and put into a song. So it's a different way of singing, and I'm very excited about exploring my firstborn as in another genre.
Well, this is wonderful. This is more than I even hoped for. We've got all this great stuff to read, to go and experience, and to watch. So this is fabulous. I will add to this that that there are 2 chapters of Maud Martha in the book that Cynthia and I co-edited back for the centennial in 2017. Seasons, the Gwendolyn Brooks Experience. It's available on Amazon and other places like that, but it is also available on our website at gwendolynbrooks.net. And so I want to also just thank everybody. Thank you, Joanne Gabbin. Thank you, Sandra Cisneros. Thank you, Sandra Jackson-Opoku. I want to thank Cynthia for her fearless adventure into the transitions, and to Darius, who thought that all the women should speak on this one. So he's been hiding behind the scenes, Darius Colquitt, feverishly putting stuff together and making things happen. And I want to thank the audience. Thank you so much for coming and checking in. Our next GB7 will be in September. It will also relate September 7th, of course, because it's always on the 7th. And it will also relate to something very special about Maud Martha, and we're not telling you a thing about that yet. So thank you all, and I want to close with just one line, and that is that in the chapter that Joanne read, the last chapter, I just want to reinforce that she woke up, the light was shining in, and she said, and I quote, and made her whisper, what am I to do with all of this life? And I hope that everyone here and everyone watching asks themselves that very good question, and have a wonderful evening.
Couldn't be heard.